So the absolute most devastating, reality-altering, and completely terrifying financial earthquake in the entire thousand-year history of the British Crown just violently erupted from deep inside a heavily fortified, deeply subterranean Swiss bank vault that had been strictly legally sealed shut for nearly 3 decades. And if you have been obsessively watching the deeply panicked, highly erratic behavior of King Charles and Queen Camilla over the last few weeks, and wondering exactly why the famously arrogant royal establishment suddenly looks like they are staring directly into the barrel of an inescapable apocalyptic legal cannon, you absolutely must brace yourself and pay incredibly close attention. And you need to hit that subscribe button for Monarch Access right now as we mercilessly, completely pull back the heavy, blood-red velvet curtain on the absolute most brilliant, world-shifting, and masterfully executed posthumous revenge plot ever conceived by the late Princess Diana. You have to completely, systematically erase every single sanitized, heavily manipulated narrative the ruthless palace public relations machine has ever fed you about Diana's tragic death and her final financial arrangements, because the incredibly naive, widely accepted global belief that she simply left her 2 sons a modest collection of historic jewelry, a few sentimental letters, and a standard, heavily taxed inheritance fund is actually nothing more than a brilliant, highly effective, deliberately constructed smokescreen designed specifically to hide a terrifyingly massive, completely untouchable shadow financial empire. The incredibly explosive, entirely cinematic sequence of events officially kicked off on a freezing, rain-swept midnight in London when a highly obscure, deeply secretive senior Swiss constitutional attorney, a man whose elite, hyper-discreet Zurich law firm specializes exclusively in protecting the anonymous wealth of the global 1% from government seizure, quietly, nervously bypassed all standard diplomatic channels, completely evaded the incredibly intrusive MI6 surveillance grid, and arrived unannounced at the heavily guarded rear service entrance of Kensington Palace, carrying absolutely nothing but a single, heavily reinforced, biometric titanium briefcase, and demanding an immediate, unrecorded, completely private audience exclusively with Prince William. According to incredibly deep, highly vetted palace insiders, who are currently risking absolute personal and professional ruin to aggressively leak this explosive information, when William finally authorized the highly irregular meeting and placed his thumb onto the encrypted scanner of the titanium briefcase in the dead silence of his private study, what spilled out onto the polished mahogany desk was not a simple, sentimental final letter from his late mother, but rather a highly weaponized, legally binding, absolutely ironclad international sovereign trust document that explicitly, undeniably proved that in the incredibly turbulent, deeply chaotic final 2 years of her life, Princess Diana had actively, secretly, and brilliantly orchestrated the most aggressive, highly classified, and massive extraction of private wealth in modern royal history. Knowing with absolute, terrifying, unyielding certainty that the deeply corrupt, highly vindictive royal establishment, and specifically the ruthlessly ambitious Camilla, would eventually, inevitably attempt to financially completely isolate, control, and manipulate her sons the exact moment she was no longer there to physically protect them, Diana had incredibly quietly, masterfully forged a deeply secretive, unbreakable financial alliance with a highly elite, totally invisible network of incredibly powerful international billionaires, global tech titans, and fiercely loyal foreign royals who absolutely despised King Charles. Together, in absolute, total secrecy, they had painstakingly, legally constructed a massive, totally unregulated, incredibly aggressive offshore sovereign wealth fund, completely outside the legal jurisdiction of the United Kingdom, entirely immune to the archaic, restrictive property laws of the British Parliament, and completely invisible to the incredibly intrusive audits of the deeply compromised royal household, explicitly seeding this hidden, untouchable empire with billions of dollars in untraceable liquid digital assets, rare earth mineral rights, and massively lucrative international corporate bonds that were strictly, legally programmed to remain totally dormant, permanently locked behind an impenetrable wall of Swiss banking secrecy, until the exact, precise moment Prince William reached a highly specific, strategically chosen age of ultimate maturity. The sheer, unadulterated, suffocating terror that violently gripped King Charles when his incredibly expensive, highly aggressive palace lawyers finally intercepted a heavily redacted, terrifyingly vague whisper of this massive international financial activation is absolutely impossible to overstate, prompting the deeply panicked, heavily perspiring king to instantly, frantically launch a massive, highly illegal, scorched earth intelligence operation, aggressively dispatching elite, heavily armed British intelligence operatives and highly paid, ruthless corporate spies to desperately try and hack, intercept, or permanently freeze the massive Swiss accounts before William could legally, officially claim the devastating inheritance. But the current, unbelievably smug monarch completely, catastrophically failed to realize that the brilliant, visionary Princess of Wales, who had meticulously, obsessively laid this invisible, brilliant trap nearly 30 years ago, had explicitly, masterfully engineered a devastating, unstoppable, completely automated legal fail-safe mechanism, having secretly entrusted the absolute sole executive control of the massive multi-billion-dollar shadow fund directly to a completely anonymous, highly ruthless board of independent, international legal executors who absolutely fiercely hated the British establishment and were legally bound by blood oaths and ironclad international treaties to immediately, ruthlessly release the entirety of the explosive, empire-dwarfing funds directly into William's private, unmonitored accounts the exact millisecond the king's desperate, corrupt agents attempted to illegally breach the Swiss banking firewall. So while the sitting, deeply corrupt king and his incredibly arrogant, totally oblivious queen consort were comfortably sitting in their gold-leaf private study, sipping expensive vintage champagne and arrogantly believing they had successfully, completely isolated and financially trapped the Prince of Wales by aggressively restricting his access to the traditional deeply controlled duchy revenues, William was suddenly, miraculously handed the ultimate, undeniable, historically verified financial sledgehammer required to utterly, completely, and permanently annihilate the corrupt regime that had ruthlessly destroyed his mother's life. William absolutely didn't frantically run to the screaming tabloid press to leak the massive world-shifting story for a quick, cheap headline. He didn't angrily post about the massive financial coup on social media. And he certainly didn't blindly, foolishly confront his heavily compromised, incredibly sick father in a noisy, useless, highly public shouting match that the palace PR machine could easily spin into a story about his supposed emotional instability. Instead, he played a terrifyingly cold, brilliantly calculated, absolutely masterful long game, quietly, seamlessly integrating this massive, entirely hidden, multi-billion-dollar war chest into a sprawling, invisible network of untouchable offshore holding companies, instantly, completely transforming himself from a financially dependent, heavily controlled royal heir into the absolute wealthiest, most financially powerful, totally untouchable individual in the entire recorded history of the British Isles, literally possessing more liquid, instantly deployable cash than the entire heavily regulated, totally illiquid Crown estate combined. The absolute explosive, world-stopping climax of this invisible, high-stakes generational war didn't happen in a sterile, boring judicial courtroom, but rather it spectacularly, violently unfolded during an incredibly tense, highly classified, closed-door emergency financial summit inside the heavily guarded, ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle. A meeting that Charles had personally, arrogantly orchestrated specifically to publicly, loudly force William into signing a deeply restrictive, highly manipulative new financial covenant designed to permanently strip the Wales family of their remaining autonomy. Picture the incredibly tense, overwhelmingly cinematic scene. The grand, historic, sprawling library is absolutely packed with the most elite, deeply corrupt, powerful royal accountants, shady palace lawyers, and highly complicit senior courtiers, all aggressively, smugly staring down the Prince of Wales, while King Charles and Queen Camilla sit proudly, arrogantly, at the absolute head of the massive oak table, pushing a thick, legally binding, highly restrictive contract across the polished wood, completely, utterly oblivious to the terrifying fact that the very ground beneath their expensive leather shoes was about to completely, violently, and permanently collapse. Just as the beaming, sweating king proudly ordered his son to immediately sign away his future, William simply, coldly smiled, entirely ignoring the pen, and instead slowly, purposefully reached into his tailored jacket, pulling out a single, incredibly thin, unassuming black leather folder containing the certified, undeniable, fully authenticated Swiss banking ledgers, alongside a massive, towering, incredibly heavy stack of freshly signed, legally binding, highly aggressive international injunctions that explicitly, immediately proved that William had already, quietly, and entirely legally purchased the absolute controlling municipal debt of the exact private corporate entities that currently, secretly held the mortgages on Camilla's most prized, highly secretive personal luxury estates. When William calmly, deliberately placed the black leather folder directly onto the polished surface of the table, he looked his incredibly terrified, hyperventilating father dead in the eyes, and quietly, ruthlessly informed him, in a perfectly modulated, entirely ice-cold voice, that his fraudulent, highly manipulative financial reign over the family was officially, permanently over, revealing with devastating absolute clarity that William now possessed the absolute, unchecked, untraceable financial power to single-handedly bankrupt the entire private, off-the-books aristocratic network that Camilla had spent decades ruthlessly building. The sheer, unadulterated, suffocating panic that instantly, violently washed over Camilla's sweaty, ashen, heavily made-up face was absolutely impossible to fake, because in that single, devastating, entirely catastrophic millisecond of absolute clarity, she realized with blinding, agonizing, world-shattering certainty that her incredibly expensive, highly paid defense lawyers absolutely couldn't save her. Her vast, carefully hoarded, stolen billions were completely, utterly eclipsed by the absolute financial tsunami Diana had secretly built, and her deeply corrupt, meticulously constructed cover-up had just been spectacularly, flawlessly, and publicly dismantled by the lingering, incredibly powerful ghost of the exact same woman she had spent her entire life trying to erase. The deeply arrogant, incredibly powerful courtiers and high society sycophants, who had literally just spent the entire morning desperately kissing the king's ring, suddenly, physically and instinctively began backing away from the table in absolute sheer terror, quickly realizing with ruthless, self-preserving clarity that the absolute center of gravity in the room had just violently, permanently shifted forever, and that the Prince of Wales was no longer just an heir waiting patiently for his turn, but rather an absolute, terrifying, financially invincible, sovereign entity operating completely entirely above the ancient laws of the monarchy itself. For William, the ultimate, sweeping, total victory absolutely wasn't about finally acquiring the massive, multi-billion-dollar fortune, securing the sprawling global real estate portfolio, or gaining the fleeting hollow adoration of the exact same hypocritical elites. It was entirely, profoundly, and completely about restoring the sacred, historical, untarnished honor of his brutally wronged mother, fiercely, loyally executing her final, brilliant, unyielding will, and conclusively, undeniably proving to the entire, intently watching world that the pure, protective, absolute love of a mother will always, inevitably, and flawlessly outmaneuver the temporary, fleeting, deeply toxic arrogance of incredibly greedy usurpers, proving exactly why the absolute greatest, most devastating, entirely world-shifting battles for immense, unimaginable power are almost never actually fought with loud, explosive public arguments, but are always, inevitably, and absolutely fought in the deafening, terrifying silence of locked, forgotten archival vaults, executed by incredibly smart, highly calculated people who intimately understand that true, lasting, permanent revenge is a dish best served exactly 3 decades cold. So if you want to stay consistently, firmly ahead of the curve, and deeply understand the real, unvarnished, totally authentic stories before they ever officially break on the heavily controlled mainstream television networks, make sure you hit subscribe, turn on those notifications, because the intense, high-stakes royal drama is absolutely never, ever over, and the absolute best, most shocking, utterly empire-destroying secrets are always still waiting patiently in the freezing dark to be ultimately, spectacularly discovered.